Okay, so we're going to be completely creating the authentication process here. So there's quite a lot to do. But what we're doing is we're creating this auth class, or this Twitter auth class. We're going to chop this up into smaller methods as we can, just so we can make reuse of things, keep the code tidy and things like that. Also make it much easier to maintain as well. But the first thing we want to tackle is the dependency injection. Now we're going to need to inject our database, an instance of our database class, and CodeBird as well into this class. And that might sound complicated, but it's actually fairly straightforward. Let's first of all start defining this class out. Remember, we've already got this included, so we can start to instantiate that within inside of index or something like that. So we're going to need a couple of things. We're going to need a database instance, which we'll be injecting in later. We're going to need a client. In this case, this is the CodeBird client. In actual fact, let's get rid of this database instance. We'll deal with that later, just so we don't confuse things. Now I'm also going to store a callback URL here. So let's say, well, we'll call this client callback. Now this needs to match exactly what we provided in our Twitter app when we created it. So this is basically just this URL here with callback.php on the end. So that's that. We'll be using that with CodeBird later. We'll sort of inject this in. But we need to obviously construct this. So let's create a construct method. So our magic method here. Now this is going to basically just set this DB to DB and this. In fact, we're going to get rid of that, aren't we? We'll do that later. So this client equals client. So the client is basically passed into this class when we instantiate it here. Let's get rid of that. So we're going to say something like client equals new Twitter auth. We'll call this auth actually. And then we pass in our client. So we just pass that in. And we can type hint this as well if we want. Again, we're going to have to namespace this. So CodeBird. So that needs to be an instance of this. In this case, it will be. Just useful to type hint as well. So let's check if this works. And there we go. We don't see any problem. So just to verify this, we can do a var dump on this client, like so. So that's still working. So we now make use of this. We've injected it in, and that just basically means that we're not depending on this being instantiated inside of this class. So now what we're going to do is we're going to deal with the getAuthURL method. So let's create a method for this. Public function, we'll call this getAuthURL. So what this is going to do is we need to request tokens and then verify those tokens, and CodeBird make this really easy for us. So let's create a protected function here, and we're going to call this request tokens. The reason I call this request tokens is we need to request two OAuth tokens, which is the normal OAuth token and the private one as well. So what we need to do here is return from this the tokens. So I'm just going to take the example straight from the GitHub repo, and we're going to say this client. Remember, we've stored that up here now, so we can make use of this within any of our methods. And we call OAuth request token. And then inside of here we have an array. I'm using the shorthand, but you're more than welcome to use the long array, which may not be available for your PHP version. And in here we have a property called OAuth callback. Now you might have guessed what this is. It's the client callback. So it's this client callback. So that verifies that. And then what we want to do is store those tokens. But let's just do a var dump on this reply. So getAuthURL is eventually going to return our authentication URL, but for now, let's just call this request tokens. Okay, so let's take a look at what this does. We need to call this from here. So let's say auth request sorry, no auth, get auth URL. Okay, so that's going to call the method. We get a little bit of a delay, but here we go. We've got an object back with the OAuth token, the OAuth token secret, and a couple of other bits as well, including HTTP status, which we'll be using later, which is really important. We'll be verifying that as well. So now we've done this, we want this get auth URL to return us the actual authentication URL. So I'm going to echo this out here, and down here what I'm going to do is actually store these tokens. Now what all this is going to do is it's going to call another method. So let's just define this here, protected function store tokens, and this is going to take a token and a token secret, and all that's going to do is place them into sessions. Remember, in init we called session start, so we can make use of these as well as determining if the user's logged in or not. So we're going to say OAuth token, and that is going to be assigned the value that we pass in token, and we also have a session here called OAuth token, this time the secret one, and again fairly straightforward. That just takes the value that's passed in here. So here we can say this store tokens, and we can access, because this it's an object, we're going to access the OAuth token and the OAuth token secret. So we are up here getting the auth URL. We're not actually getting it yet, but we're requesting the tokens. Once we've requested the tokens and they've been stored in a session, we then want to verify them. So we're going to call this verify tokens. And the reason we're splitting these up is we need to use the verify tokens when we sign in as well. So down here, let's create another protected method called verify tokens. So this will send these tokens to the Twitter API to verify, and we use the set token method on the client for this. So we say this client set token, and we pass in these two. So in this case it's session OAuth token, and you may want to store the names of these sessions somewhere. Obviously things like the client callback you'd store in your configuration settings, or you would generate automatically, whatever. But you know, for the sake of simplicity, we'll just keep this as hard-coded values. So OAuth token secret. So once we've verified the tokens, that will error if there's anything wrong with these. But from getAuthURL, we want to return this client. So we're accessing our CodeBird instance, and we want to say OAuth authenticate. And that's it. So what this should do now is return us with a URL that we can go through to. Perfect. So this is the URL that we want to apply to our link when a user goes and signs in. So let's create a couple of bits on our index page to deal with this. So we know that we've got a method called that now. We can start to create some markup. So we want to eventually do some checking. So let's just quickly implement this. We want to do an if statement here to say if auth signed in. We haven't even created this method yet, but we'll do that in just a moment, just to return false, just while we sort of do this. Otherwise, we're going to want to output that link that takes us through to Twitter. So I've just done some shorthand here. We've got if you're signed in, we're going to say you are signed in, and then we're going to have a link here to sign out, and we'll link that up to signout.php, which we'll create later. So otherwise, here is our link. So sign in with Twitter, and in here, as you probably guessed, we can just echo auth get auth URL. So let's create this sign in method just so we can test this out. So this is going to be a public function, what was it called again? Signed in. And for now, this is going to return false. So that gives us then a sign in with Twitter link. What we can do now is click on that. That will take us through here, and we automatically see all of this. So it's, you know, it's fairly straightforward. The library we're using does all this and fetches this URL for us. So we can now actually authorize this app. But what's going to happen now is when we click sign in with Twitter and we authorize, that's going to come back to callback.php. And we have created this file, but we obviously don't have any contents in here at the moment. But what you can see is we've got this OAuth token and this OAuth verifier that's been passed through. So what we now need to do is create some methods that allow us to actually check if this value is available, and then secondly, actually sign the user in. So what we're going to do is inside of our callback.php file, we're actually going to check if the sign in was successful. If it is, we're going to redirect the user to the index page. Otherwise, we're just going to kill the page and say that the sign in failed. So in callback.php, let's create an instance of our Twitter auth. So this is going to be your new Twitter auth, and that is going to pass in the client as a dependency. And we're now going to create an if statement just here with an else, and basically this is just going to say if auth sign in. That's going to check if the sign in was successful. So we're going to, if that's the case, do a redirect to index.php. You can do whatever you want here. Now otherwise we're going to just kill the page and we're going to say sign in failed. Fairly straightforward. So inside of our Twitter auth, let's create another public method here, sign in, and this is going to be a slightly longer method. We could technically break this up, but we'll create all of the functionality in here that we need. So the first thing I want to do is check if we have a callback, and by that I mean basically does this OAuth verifier token exist. So we're going to say if this has callback. We haven't obviously got this method yet, so let's just bung this down here. Protected function has callback. So this is basically just going to return whether $_get, this is accessing the get superglobal, and it is OAuth _verifier. So we're basically just checking if that exists. So we can basically just copy and paste this into here. There we go. So this is going to return either true or false. If it's true, let's kill this and just say yay or something like that. Okay, so now this will actually give us that value. So we know that that if statement is now working based on the fact that that token has been passed through. Now the next thing to do is verify the tokens. Again, the tokens that we stored in the session earlier. So let's verify tokens. If this is incorrect, we will get an error. You can see here that we've got a sign in failed already. That's just because we're not doing anything. So we're going to return false by default, and in here we're going to return true. We'll wrap that later. So basically this is just checking tokens, and it looks like it's a successful sign in here, but we're not really doing anything. This is where you have to be careful that you're not slipping up in, you know, how things are working. But we're going to be doing a check in here in a minute, which absolutely requires that the response from Twitter is acceptable. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a similar thing to what we did down here, requesting tokens. But this time what we're going to actually do is we're going to get our access token. So we create a new variable called reply, and again this is just pulled from the GitHub documentation. So we're going to say OAuth access token, and again I'm going to use an array in here. And this time what we want to do, instead of passing through the callback like we did here, we already know that the we've got the valid URL. We're going to pass through the verify token. So verifier is going to be get OAuth verifier. You might want to store, you might want to create another method to return this verifier if you want, since we've created a method up here to check it. Entirely up to you. So now let's do a var dump. Let's kill this, and let's do a var dump on the reply. So let's check this out. So we're going to hit sign in. Oops. Let's just try this again. Oh, okay, right. So this is working now. So let's authorize this app. That's going to redirect us back. And now we are doing a var dump on what we get back here. So you can see that first of all, we're getting the account that I'm signing in with's details here. So this is giving me the user ID that I'm actually authenticating with, and that's the same as this owner ID because I'm basically using the app on my account but also signing in with my account. So in this case it's the same, so we know that this is the user ID. Obviously we've got this here as well, and this is a string. We've got the screen name as well, which is just my Twitter username, and the HTTP status as well. So the first thing that we want to do here is check that the HTTP status is 200. That's really important. Now actually, just a point here, if this fails, so if the OAuth verify token is incorrect, we will actually get an error here. Now if I refresh again, you see that we've got a invalid expired token because we've used this token already, we've verified with this token here already, and then therefore it's given us this error. So basically, if we were to try and make this up, we still wouldn't allow users to authenticate. So this obviously going through OAuth through Twitter's API is really secure. So as I mentioned, we want to check if the replies HTTP status is 200. You can check for other codes and you can do really whatever you want here, but I'm just doing it for the sake of it here. And we're going to keep the return true with inside of here, so return true. But there's a couple of things we need to do inside of here, and that is store the tokens again. So this case, we're going to store the new tokens, and this is from the reply. Remember, we saw the OAuth token and the OAuth token secret again. That came from this reply, so we can store them. And then what we also want to do is we want to just set a session. This can be whatever you want, to be honest. You can call it user ID, you can call it Twitter ID, whatever. If you're using other applications to authenticate, so Google or something like that, you may need to just keep this for something generic. But in this case, I'm just going to set user ID to reply user ID, like this. And then what we want to do is we want to eventually store the user. So store the user here. We'll call a method to do that in the next part. So let's check this is all working. The last thing that we need to do actually is create the signed in method, or create the actual functionality within the signed in method. So at the moment this is returning false, whether we're actually signed in or not. Let's head back to the index.php file, implement this, and then we will try the sign in process again. Now here, this is fairly straightforward. Because we've set this session down here, we know that if this user ID session is set, that means the user is signed in. You can use other methods, it's entirely up to you, but I'm just going to be checking if this is set. You may want to do something different here. Cool, so let's try this out. I'll go ahead and open up my cookies here so I can remove this just to get rid of the session in a minute. So sign in with Twitter. That takes us through. I want to authorize this, and then there we are. You are signed in. Let's get rid of the PHP session ID, and there we go. We've done it. So what we're going to do is we are going to also now look at just signing the user out. Really, really straightforward. All we need to do here is we need to create a new file. And we'll call this signout.php. We need to do pretty much exactly the same as what's done in here. I guess we can just copy and paste that over. Obviously accept this, and we don't need our ending tag. So to sign out, we basically just need to call auth sign out, which we haven't created, and then we want to redirect the user to location index.php. Okay, so inside of Twitter auth, let's just create this sign out method. And again, it's as simple as checking if the user is signed in. We're just going to unset the session like that. So let's check if this works. We're going to sign in. We're going to authorize the app, and we're going to sign out. Then we're going to sign in again, and there we are. So we actually need to do one more thing just to allow this to work really well. Under your settings for your actual app, if you head down, you can see this allow this application to be used with sign in with Twitter. We need to go ahead and actually tick this. We'll go ahead and update the settings. And once they're updated, let's head back over here. Okay, so now what's going to happen is when we hit sign in with Twitter, this is automatically going to redirect us back. And the reason for that is under your Twitter settings, you'll see that you have authenticated with this application. Now, if you revoke the access, what's going to happen is that application will disappear. And when you go ahead and sign in again, it will ask you for authorization to use my account rather than what we saw earlier, which was just authorizing the app. So we're now actually working with sign in with Twitter rather than just the authentication process. So when we hit sign in now, we're sort of persistently signed in. We can hit sign out, and when we sign in again, this will just automatically redirect us back as long as the user is actually signed in to their Twitter account. So that is pretty much it. We've built the main part of the application. What we're going to look at next, though, is actually storing the user details in the database if you want to identify them and go ahead and store other information. This obviously isn't completely necessary. You don't need to do this at all. But if you do need to store information against the user, this is really useful.